Chapter 12. The Train That Waited. Winter held the town in a quiet hand on the evening Aiden was due to return. The kind of evening that seems to be listening. The kind of air that holds its breath so feet will land softly on the pavement. The cafe had closed early so the owner could walk home before the snow thickened. Yet she left the market lantern glowing on the shelf for travelers who looked through the window on their way to the station, and its blue pane gathered every bit of light with patient calm. Mira stopped by the door and watched the soft square flicker on the fern leaves and on the board where cards from neighbors layered like pale scales. She read Aiden's last card again even though she knew it by heart. The one that said "I am back and grateful," placed there just a few days ago, and her chest warmed in the small way a kettle warms as it begins to think about boiling. She carried his letters in a cloth pouch inside her coat, each one pressed with the gentle scent of the sprig from the hotel sill. And she had added fresh lavender to the pouch that afternoon because it felt kind to bring one small piece of summer into an evening like this. The station sat at the edge of the square, a modest brick building with wide wooden benches and a clock that liked to give travelers an extra minute when snow covered the tracks. By the time she reached the platform, snow had begun to fall in soft threads, not rushing, only settling, the kind that turns sounds into slow shapes and wraps the world in a hush that feels like a page turned without a crease. The attendant behind the glass told her the evening train had been delayed beyond the hills, that drifts were building near a narrow cut through a field where the wind always wanted to play, and that the crew would clear them but no one could say when. Mira nodded, thanked him, and chose a bench near the western window. She set her small bag at her feet and folded her hands around a cup she had brought from the cafe, still warm with tea that tasted faintly of cinnamon because she had rested a stick in the water while she walked. She did not worry in the hard way. The week of letters had taught her that time can be asked to sit, and if asked carefully it often will. She watched the snow gather on the curve of the rail and melt where the iron still held the day's heat, and she let the room find its quiet balance around her. A boy with red mittens and a wool cap sat across the aisle with his father, counting the lamps along the platform and whispering the numbers as if telling them a bedtime story. A woman in a coat the color of dusk embroidered a little green leaf on a square of cloth, the steady needle making a tiny sound that belonged in a room like this. The attendant set a bowl of water near the heater for the station cat, a mild creature with a patient tail that swayed as if measuring the hour. Mira pulled her scarf closer, resting her chin on the soft fold the way a reader rests a thumb against a familiar page. She thought about the greenhouse hill dressed in white and how the sea would be speaking in short phrases for a change, each wave folding and then smoothing like an iron on a clean sheet. She imagined Aiden on a car that waited in a long line of snow and light, his hand on his satchel, his eyes remembering the brick wall of the city and the letters he had folded with care, the line he had written about the piano tuning, the way a note climbs and settles and knows. She opened the cloth pouch and took out his most recent letter, the one from the morning before he boarded, and read it again. The paper had learned the weight of his hand, and the words had learned how to sit together without pushing. He had written that the street under his window looked rinsed and that a person across the way had watered a plant and then stood looking at it for a long time, as if waiting to hear it speak, and that he had felt a pull like a tide toward the hill and the bench and the kettle and her. When she finished reading, she pressed the sheet back into the pouch and tucked it close so the letters could keep each other warm. The snow thickened and the station adjusted. The boy fell asleep against his father's side. The woman with the embroidery put away her work and folded her hands as if cradling the pattern in her lap. Two men who had come in from the cold shook snow from their hats at the door and then swept the floor quietly with a brush kept by the wall, the sort of simple work that takes no explaining. A small group of friends arrived with easy voices and sat near the far bench, telling stories so low the sound lived only among themselves. The clock traded a minute for calm. Mira walked down the platform once to stretch her legs and watch the soft drift fill the edge between rail and plank. When she returned to her bench, she pulled out her own paper and wrote a short note she would not send, at least not tonight. It said that the station smelled like bread from the bakery and wool from coats and something faint and clean from falling snow, and that she felt completely awake and sleepy at the same time, and that she kept seeing the small bubble in the pale aqua glass whenever light touched the window, and that she could not wait to place it with him. She folded the page and slid it into the pouch beside the others. Midnight felt far away and then felt near because time grows elastic when people gather for the same gentle purpose. The attendant came by with news carried in that careful voice stations keep. The drift crews had cleared the first long bend and the train had begun to move again, but it would slow and pause at each cut to be sure. Mira thanked him and watched the snow ease and then return, as if the night had decided to give the town a soft gift in small handfuls. She thought of the lantern on the cafe shelf burning low and of the owner lifting her hand to shield the flame when she pinched it out for rest. She thought of the library lamp called Quiet Company and the way the librarian placed a saucer for cups that needed a place to belong. She let these images keep her steady. At the hilltop, the greenhouse wore a pale outline of frost on its glass panes that glimmered each time the moon stepped from a bank of cloud. The sea moved like a sleeping chest. In the station, a heater clicked and then sighed, clicked and then sighed like a person trying to remember a song in the right order. Mira poured the last of her tea into the cup and smiled at the steam rising in a faint ribbon. When she glanced at the clock again, the hands still kept their true positions, but the room felt different, the kind of different that means a thought has turned into a fact. A faint tone sounded down the line, then another, then the short, precise call of a horn not far off. Heads lifted like flowers turning toward light. The cat rose and stretched with the seriousness of a worker who takes pride in good timing. Snow churned somewhere beyond the bend and came spinning through the platform lamps like confetti made by clouds for a celebration they could not attend. The train slid into view with a low rush and a gentle squeal, almost apologetic for arriving so late, as if it understood that waiting is work and wanted to say thank you. Mira stood. She did not hurry. She felt the night open a little wider, the way a door opens when someone approaches it from the outside and the room is ready. She walked toward the carriage with the cloth pouch inside her coat and her scarf warm against her chin. The doors opened with a soft sigh and people stepped down into the white breath of the station. She watched them as they looked for faces and lifted hands and called quiet greetings and took their bags. A figure stepped onto the platform with a satchel at his shoulder and a folded coat under his arm, and he paused as if listening for something only he could hear and then turned his head the way he always did, a small habit she knew as well as her own. Aiden lifted his eyes and found her. No word felt necessary and none arrived. They moved toward each other with the even pace of people who have learned how to be deliberate. And when they met, they stood for a second very close and then folded into an embrace that felt like a room closing at last on a night that had waited for its guest. Snow settled lightly on their shoulders and on the crown of her scarf and on the back of his hand where the veins rose faintly from the cold. The station sounds softened as if made shy by the sight. The clock continued to do its small, faithful work. The cat turned in a circle and sat. The boy in red mittens woke just enough to see two people holding each other and smiled without thinking because it looked like the correct shape for relief. Aiden did not know how long they stood like that and did not wish to. A minute can stretch when it has a good reason. He felt the shape of the cloth pouch under her coat and understood the way she had carried his words and her own and the smell of lavender through a waiting room and out into the snow. He breathed in the cold and the faint trace of her hair and the hint of cinnamon at the edge of her scarf. He let his hand rest for a moment at the curve of her shoulder, a place that fit him without asking questions. When they finally stepped back slightly, he looked at her eyes first, then at the faint line the snow had left along her lashes, and he smiled in the quiet way he kept for the few moments of his life he did not want to push with speech. She smiled back with the sort of simplicity that makes a person believe in ordinary miracles, then touched his sleeve and nodded toward the warm room. They carried his satchel together as if it were larger than it was because sharing weight feels good after separation. Inside, the attendant lifted the partition to pour 2 cups of tea from a thermos he kept for late trains, and he placed a small plate of biscuits on the counter. And Mira thanked him in a voice that made the station seem like a hearth. They stood by the window and watched the snow ease into a gentler fall while they drank, not even trying to fill the space with words, letting the act of standing together do the talking. Aiden told the attendant the train had been careful and the crew had been kind and that the delay had felt like a long breath rather than a test. And the attendant nodded as if that matched his own view of nights like this one. When the cups were empty, the 3 of them listened to the heater click once more. And then Aiden turned to Mira with the small lift of his chin that meant ready, and she answered with the small tilt of her head that meant yes. They stepped back into the falling snow and took the lane toward the square. The town had softened into shapes that remembered themselves without detail. Lamps on stoops made short halos that warmed the path. The cafe window was dark. But inside the shelf and the lantern and the fern were still visible like objects in a dream where a person knows exactly where they are even without light. They paused to look, and Aiden put his palm to the glass as if he could feel the last warmth from the afternoon through it, then drew a tiny heart with the tip of his finger before the fog faded. Mira laughed, that soft sound that belongs to her and no one else, and touched her glove to the mark as if to save it for a moment longer. Then they climbed the hill toward the greenhouse where the snow lay in a thin sugar on the path and crunched kindly under their boots. The glass house greeted them with a faint starry sheen along the panes. Inside, the air turned soft the moment the door closed, and their breath joined a gentler rhythm. The bench waited with the letters stacked at one end under the cloth pouch. The lantern frame with its new hooks rested on the table, the pale aqua piece on its cloth like a drop of sea made into glass. Aiden set his satchel down and took off his gloves and pressed his palms together until they warmed, then reached for the kettle that Mira kept by the little ring of fire and filled it and lit the blue thumb of flame. They did not rush to speak of snow or drifts or stations. They let the room do the talking. When the kettle began to think about singing, Mira opened the pouch and set the letters out in a neat line the way a person sets stones along a path to see where a walk has taken them. Aiden touched each corner with the back of a finger and felt relief settle in as calmly as the slow pour of tea into a cup. He took out the small pencil he had promised to bring, the one that felt like a winter morning, and set it beside her brush on the table as a simple sign of return. The steam from the cups rose in thin lines that made the cold outside seem like a polite visitor waiting on the doorstep. They sat with their shoulders almost touching and talked softly about how the city had looked when snow began and how the station yard had sounded when the first horn called through the night. He told her about the crew clearing the last bend with quiet teamwork and about the way the carriage had fallen still the moment the brakes took hold and the wheels stopped singing. She told him about the clock at the station and how it had given an extra minute or two as if to encourage patience, and about the boy with the red mittens and the woman with the tiny green leaf, and about the cat who took its work seriously. They fell silent at the same time and did not need to explain why. When they stood again, they moved toward the table and held the pale aqua piece between them so that the lantern hooks caught its drilled edge. The glass had learned the room while they spoke and now seemed eager to live in it. They lifted the frame only a little and let the piece hang and settle, then stepped back together to see if the balance felt right. It did. The bubble near the center glowed faintly as if the sea had exhaled into the glass once and decided to stay. They agreed with a glance that they would place the next piece tomorrow and not tonight. There is a shape to patience, and they had learned it well. The snow eased outside and then returned in smaller flakes, as if the cloud had run its hand through a bowl of sugar and decided not to waste the last sweetness. The lighthouse turned and blinked in its measured way along the far edge of the town. The station platform stood empty now, yet the benches remembered weight and the heater held one last warmth in its metal. Aiden drew a small sketch of the station window with snow at its corners and a pair of hands wrapped around a cup, not naming the hands, only letting their shape tell the story. He wrote a simple line beneath the drawing and set the book down to dry. They carried their cups to the sink and let the water run low and steady, and the sound made the greenhouse feel like a small kitchen, which pleased them both. When he reached for his coat again, the lavender from the pouch rose like a note from a piano that had been tuned to the exact room. Mira took the pouch and tied it closed with the ribbon she had used the first day of frost. They stepped outside with the lights turned low so the plants could sleep, closed the door, and stood for a moment with the hill and the path and the soft white breathing of the town stretched below them. He took her hand and she let her fingers rest inside his glove for a second, the way her pressed leaves once rested inside the book on the cafe board. And the warmth of that small act traveled up both of their arms and into their chests and then settled at the exact pace the night requested. Down the slope the station clock continued its quiet duty. Across the square the cafe sign hung still and patient. The road home was short and friendly, and the snow underfoot made that crisp sound that proves a day has ended exactly as it should. They walked without speaking, two shadows falling together on the pale ground, and the town carried them like a careful palm carries a light, not to hide it, only to keep it steady until sleep opened its door and